A cabin in the dark. No power. No sound but the wind pressing against wood like a hand testing a locked door. Callum Rourke stood in the center of the room with his back to the cold fireplace, his body still as breathing controlled. Scout was strapped against his chest in a canvas sling, the puppy's warmth the only thing in the room that felt certain. The boy weighed almost nothing. He weighed everything. Kira stood at the door. She did not bark. She did not pace. She faced the wood with her ears pitched forward, and her chest low, her weight settled into her front legs, the way she stood when the world outside had changed shape, and she was deciding what it had become. The knock came slow, measured, the kind of knock that did not ask permission. It assumed the door would open because doors had always opened for the man on the other side. Then the voice, "Last chance, Callum," smooth, patient. The words slipped through the grain of the wood like smoke through a seam, and they carried with them the particular confidence of a man who believed that time had always worked in his favor and saw no reason tonight should be different. Silence answered. The door handle turned, tested once, tested again. Kira's shoulder dropped half an inch. Her breath changed. Not faster. Focused. She was reading something beyond the door that Callum could not hear, and whatever it was, she had already decided what it meant. Then glass broke somewhere behind the cabin and the night rushed in. 8 days earlier. Before you hear how this began, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments, and if this story moves, you don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of compassion and courage. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Winter did not arrive gently in the northern Bay towns. It came clean and sharp, stripping sound from the air and turning every hesitation into consequence. The sky pressed low over the harbor like a ceiling that had lost patience with the room beneath it. Snow moved sideways, then down, then sideways again, filling tracks before they could become paths, turning the familiar into something that had to be relearned with every step. The town sat where the coast bent inward, and the hills rose behind it, like a wall built by someone who wanted the sea to stay where it was. In summer, the bay caught light and held it. In winter, the bay caught cold and held that instead. Fishing boats sat motionless at the dock. Storefronts dimmed early. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight lines that the wind bent and scattered before they reached the height of the church steeple. And the church steeple itself disappeared into cloud, as if even God had decided that visibility was optional tonight. On the hill above, it all set back from the road where the trees thinned and the land flattened into a shelf of rock and frozen grass, a cabin sat alone. Its roof bowed slightly under the weight of snow that had been accumulating since November. Its porch boards were swept clean, not from hospitality, but from the habit of a man who believed that disorder invited consequence. A single window glowed with the low amber of a fire that was fed but not encouraged. The light did not reach far. It was not meant to. Callum Rourke stood inside that cabin the way he stood inside most rooms. Alert, contained, present without being available. He was 40 years old, and his body carried those years the way a well-maintained tool carries use. Tall in a way that came from bone structure rather than posture, broad across the shoulders, without bulk, his frame kept in working order by discipline rather than vanity. His face was clean-shaven, the jaw angular, and set in a way that suggested he had learned long ago to hold words in place until they were needed. His hair was dark brown, cut short on the sides in a neat undercut that had not changed style in 15 years. His eyes were the color of cold steel mixed with morning sky blue-gray, and watchful, the kind of eyes that saw exits before they saw furniture. He wore what he always wore, a fitted green camouflage long-sleeve shirt and matching pants, the fabric soft from washing but intact. A dark tactical belt sat at his waist, with a utility pouch and a holster-shaped carrier that suggested tools were never far from reach, even when the nearest threat was silence. His tan military boots, weighted by the hearth laces, loosened but not untied. A metal watch with a black face caught the firelight when he moved his wrist, and he moved his wrist, now stacking wood beside the stove with the efficiency of a man who managed warmth the way other men managed conversation. One piece at a time. Enough to keep going. Never enough to get comfortable. Behind him, on the mantel above the fireplace, a framed photograph rested slightly off-center. A woman smiled from it, dark hair pulled back from a face that held warmth the way certain faces did not, as expression but as architecture. Her eyes were steady and kind, the kind of eyes that found you in a crowded room and made the crowd disappear. Mara. She had been pregnant when she died. A winter road, a patch of black ice. A phone call that arrived after the words it carried had already become permanent. Callum had promised to be home before the storm. The storm came early, or he came late. The difference did not matter to the outcome. He did not look at the photograph often. He did not need to. It looked at him enough. He placed the last piece of wood on the stack and straightened. The cabin was quiet. The fire spoke in its low language. The wind tested the windows the way it always did not, trying to break in, just reminding everything inside that outside still existed and was not impressed. Callum stood at the counter and stared at a mug he had not filled. His reflection caught in the dark window glass, the line of his jaw set too hard. The old burn mark on the inside of his wrist pale where the light found it. He had earned that mark in a place he no longer named. He had earned most of what he carried in places he no longer named. The Navy had trained him to enter rooms that could kill him. It had not trained him to stay in rooms that couldn't. On that same night at the bottom of the hill where the harbor road bent past a row of houses pressed close together against the cold, something was happening that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the kind of violence that never makes the news. A German shepherd puppy, barely a month old, lay on a frozen porch where he had been thrown. His body trembled against the boards. His fur still too young to have decided its texture, stuck up at odd angles, black and tan fuzz that offered nothing against the wind. One leg lay at the wrong angle beneath him, the bone cracked and displaced, swelling fast under skin that was already losing its fight against the cold. He did not cry. Puppies that young rarely did when pain passed beyond surprise and into something deeper. He only made a thin sound in his throat, a breath that fogged once and vanished. His crime had been small and animal simple. He had followed the smell of meat. He had eaten what had been set aside. He did not know the rules of ownership. He did not know that hunger could be punished. The boot had come fast. The shout had followed. The door had closed. The puppy's mother heard the sound of wrong immediately. She was 5 years old, heavy in the chest and thick in her winter coat, her black and tan fur darkened by frost along the saddle of her back. Her ears stood straight, even when fear pressed against her ribs. Her name, though no one had called it in a long time, was Kira. She did not attack. She did not snarl. She moved. She lowered her head and took the puppy gently by the scruff, lifting him with a care that came from a place older than any training. His body hung awkwardly, the damaged leg tucked wrong, his warmth already fading into the air. She turned away from the house that had stopped being shelter and began to walk. She went where light still existed. The first door opened a crack. A woman's face appeared pale under a scarf, eyes darting from the puppy's leg to the falling snow. "I can't," she said, and the words came out like something she had rehearsed. A frozen heel of bread landed on the step. The door closed. At the second house, a man leaned out just long enough to see the blood-dark patch spreading through the puppy's fur. He swore, softly pulled out his phone, and tried to call animal control. The line rang into nothing. The storm swallowed the sound the way it swallowed footsteps. He looked at the dog. He looked at the night. The door closed again. No one slammed anything. No one laughed. No one was cruel on purpose. They were simply afraid of the cold and what it demanded, and fear, when it is quiet enough, looks exactly like indifference. By the time Kira reached the hill road, her legs had begun to stiffen. She had stopped lifting the puppy fully and now dragged him a few inches at a time, resting her jaw between pulls, breathing hard through her nose. Her front paws left faint red marks in the snow where the ice had done its work. She paused once and looked back toward the town where windows glowed amber and smoke rose from chimneys, and then she turned uphill again. She went toward the only light that had not closed itself, the cabin. She reached the porch and stopped. She did not bark. She did not scratch at the wood. She set the puppy down at the threshold with the kind of precision that said, this was not desperation. This was a decision. Then she looked up. Callum Rourke opened the door because sound reached him before thought. The scrape of claws on frozen wood. A breath that was not the wind. He looked down and saw the mother first standing square on the step, snow crusting her whiskers, her chest rising and falling with controlled urgency. She held his eyes directly the way working dogs did when they assessed rather than pleaded. Then he saw the puppy at her feet. The small body was barely moving. Callum knelt immediately. Training did not leave a man just because he wanted it to. His hands moved with the certainty of someone who had assessed damage in worse conditions in darker places under fire that had nothing to do with weather. He touched the puppy's ear. Cold. The inside of the mouth. Cold. The thin skin at the belly where warmth would be last to leave. Dangerous cold. The kind that did not negotiate. The leg was swollen and wrong bent at an angle that made his jaw tighten, but the leg could wait. The cold could not. 15 minutes, maybe less. That was the margin they were standing on. He scooped the puppy up, tucking the small body against his chest where his own heat could reach it, and stepped back inside. "Come," he said once, not loudly. And Kira crossed the threshold as if she had always belonged there. He wrapped the puppy in one towel, then another, rubbing gently to bring circulation back without shocking the system. He set a kettle on the stove and moved the chair closer to the fire. Kira positioned herself between the door and the bundle in his arms, standing, not resting her eyes, tracking every motion with the focus of a partner who understood time pressure as well as he did. Callum noticed things because that was what kept people alive, even when staying alive had stopped feeling like a priority. He noticed the way Kira's left front paw touched the floor with a fraction of extra care. An old injury remembered by cold. He noticed the thin margin in the puppy's breathing, the way each inhale came shallow and uncertain, the way each exhale fogged less than the one before. He checked the time. He felt the calculations settle in his chest the way calculations had settled there before, in rooms with worse odds and higher stakes. He looked at Kira. She leaned forward when he shifted the towel. He nodded the way he had nodded at teammates who understood without being told. He moved for his keys. The drive down the hill should have been impossible. The road was a narrow wound through drifts that had already begun to merge with the landscape, and the storm pressed against the windshield with a weight that felt personal. Callum drove the way he did most things. Without hesitation, without wasted motion. His headlights carved a tunnel through the white, and the white filled it back in behind him, as if the night wanted no record of his passing. In the back seat, Kira sat upright, steady. On his chest, Scout breathed, each breath smaller than the last, each breath a question that had not yet been answered. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town where the harbor road bent toward the marsh, a low building with fogged windows and a single fluorescent strip humming against the storm. Callum brought the puppy in, wrapped tight. His steps measured his breath. Controlled the way it had been trained to be when panic tried to waste time. Dr. Wren Hartwell met them halfway down the hall. She was in her early 40s, slender without fragility, her posture efficient in the way of someone who had learned to move quickly without rushing. Her hair, a practical brown, was pulled back into a low tie that kept it out of her eyes. Her face carried the quiet steadiness of a woman who had seen enough suffering to know that dramatizing it helped no one. She did not ask questions first. She read the room. The man holding the puppy like a man who knew how to hold things that were dying. The dog standing guard with the discipline of something trained by life rather than command. The leg that was wrong in a specific, practiced way. "Bring him," she said, already turning. The exam room was warm. That mattered. Wren took the puppy with hands that were firm and certain, setting him on a heated pad as a tech brought towels and monitors. She listened to his chest, checked his gums, nodded once, sharply. "Hypothermia," she said. "That's what kills first. Everything else waits." She moved to the leg. Her fingers traced the swelling with a precision that was almost gentle, almost clinical, and entirely both. The puppy flinched. Then he went still, a thin sound caught in his throat, like a word he did not yet have. Wren's expression changed. Not much. Enough. Her mouth tightened the way mouths did when something confirmed a suspicion that the person would have preferred to be wrong about. "This wasn't a fall," she said. Her voice stayed level, professional. "The displacement pattern doesn't match that story. This kind of fracture has a signature. I've seen it before." Callum pressed his palms against the counter edge. He did not interrupt. He watched Kira, who had lowered herself into a sit without instruction, her gaze fixed on the table, her body motionless, except for the slight rise and fall of her ribs. "How bad?" he asked. "The leg can be set," Wren said. "Crack displacement, soft tissue damage. Painful, but survivable." She adjusted the heating pad, checked the temperature reading. "The cold is what kills puppies this age. It shuts everything down quietly. You brought him in when it still mattered." She glanced at Kira, then back at Callum. "You did right." She worked quickly after that. Warm fluids, gentle stimulation, a splint prepared for later once the swelling reduced enough to allow it. The puppy's breathing steadied in increments so small they could have been imagined, except that Callum was not the kind of man who imagined things. He counted them. When the immediate danger passed, Wren washed her hands and leaned against the counter. She let the silence settle before she spoke again. "This isn't the first time," she said. Quiet, matter of fact. Not lately. I've seen injuries like this before. Different dogs, similar patterns. Falls that don't line up. Doors that close too hard. Paperwork that looks clean until you read it twice. She printed a report and slid it across the counter. This is a medical assessment documenting the injuries as non-accidental. If the owner shows up, this matters. She met his eyes. Paper is where these fights happen, Callum. Not in driveways, not in storms. On paper. He folded the report carefully and placed it inside his jacket against his chest, where it rested beside the warmth of the puppy, who was now breathing in a rhythm that no longer sounded like a question. "Thank you," he said. The words felt insufficient. They were what he had. The drive back up the hill felt longer than the drive down. The road lay slick under a fresh layer of ice, and the sky was beginning to bleed from black to steel at the edges, the first suggestion that the night might eventually end. In the rear seat, Kira sat as she had before. Steady, watchful. At the threshold of the clinic, she had paused, turned back, and stood blocking Callum's path for a single heartbeat. Her ears were pitched toward the darkness beyond the parking lot, toward something in the night she was reading with senses he did not possess. Then she stepped aside, and they left. Callum did not know what she had heard. He filed it away in the place where he kept things that did not yet have meaning, but might. At the cabin, he set the puppy near the stove. The fire had burned low, but the coals held. He added wood, adjusted the towels, checked the breathing again. Steady, warm, alive. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs stretched toward the heat. Kira lay between him and the door, her head on her paws, eyes open, not resting, positioned. Callum looked at the report resting on the table. He looked at the puppy wrapped in flannel. He looked at Kira, who had carried a broken life through a frozen town past closed doors and averted eyes up a hill that should have stopped her to the one door that opened. He did not know yet that the step he had taken tonight would not end here, that the door he had opened would lead to places he was not prepared for, that the dog who had blocked his path for a single breath would one day save him from something far quieter than the cold and far more dangerous. He only knew that for the first time in a very long while, the night had handed him something he could not refuse. And he had not refused it. Outside, the storm eased by 1 degree. Inside, the puppy sighed in his sleep, the sound small and warm and ordinary. Kira's ears twitched once, then settled. She was listening to the road. She was always listening to the road. And somewhere down the hill, in a house where a door had closed too hard and a silence had replaced the sound of a small body on a cold porch, someone was realizing that what he had thrown away had not stayed where he put it. The first real morning came without ceremony. Light entered the cabin sideways through the narrow window, pale and provisional, the kind of winter light that does not promise anything but shows up anyway and expects nothing in return for the showing. The storm had pulled back during the night, not gone, but resting, gathering itself in the mountains, the way storms do when they intend to return, and want the people below to know it. Snow lay heavy on the roof and along the ridge where the trees stood coated, and still their branches bent into shapes that looked like surrender but were actually patience. The world outside had been stripped clean by days of wind until only the essential remained, and everything essential was white. Inside, the fire had burned to a bed of coals that glowed orange with each shift of draft. The cabin held warmth the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully aware that carelessness would lose it. For the first time since Callum Rourke had carried a dying puppy through his door, the silence inside the cabin felt like something chosen rather than something endured. Callum woke the way he always woke, completely and at once, crossing from sleep to full awareness without the courtesy of transition. He did not move immediately. He listened. Wind lower now. The stove ticking as metal remembered shapes it held before heat changed them. And breathing. 2 sets of breathing that were not his own. Scout lay bundled near the stove in a nest of towels and the blanket Marge had brought. His small body rose and fell in a rhythm that had crossed overnight from fragile to trustworthy. The splint was clean and white against fur that still could not commit to a texture black and tan fuzz pointing in every direction, exploring everything committed to nothing. One ear lay flat. The other stood halfway as though it needed a second opinion before committing to the morning. When Callum shifted his weight, the puppy's tail moved once against the blanket. A soft thump, not quite a wag. A preliminary vote, a body learning what safety felt like and testing whether the feeling could be trusted. Kira lay between Callum and the door, exactly where she had positioned herself at nightfall. Head on pause, eyes open, amber and steady, reading the room the way she read every room, not for threats, but for changes, which in her experience were often the same thing. She had not moved because the night had not required it. The perimeter was set. The puppy breathed. The man slept in pieces, but he slept. Acceptable conditions. He knelt beside Scout. Ear temperature, gum color, belly skin, everything held. He warmed milk on the stove, tested it on his wrist, and brought the bottle down. Scout attacked the nipple with enthusiasm that far exceeded coordination, his whole head, bobbing milk escaping down both sides of his muzzle in warm lines that dripped onto Callum's fingers. He adjusted the angle. The puppy pushed harder. He adjusted again. From her position, Kira's head tilted 3 degrees. A single huff through her nose. Not alarm. Editorial comment. The sound of a professional observing an amateur. Callum tilted the bottle 2 degrees further. The puppy latched cleanly. The huffing stopped. He accepted the correction the way he accepted all corrections from competence, without ego, with the private understanding that teachability was not weakness, but the specific kind of strength that kept you alive in rooms where pride got people killed. The days arranged themselves into rhythm: heat, feed, clean, rest. The cabin began to fill with the small sounds recovery makes when given room. The grunt when the splint pressed. The sigh when warmth reached deep enough to release something cold had locked in place. The frustrated whine when itching replaced pain, which Wren said meant progress, which sounded like the indignation of a creature too young to understand that healing had the right to be uncomfortable and was exercising that right thoroughly. He spoke to the puppy during feedings and between them, not to soothe, though it soothed, to fill the space between himself and the silence he had lived inside for 2 years. He told Scout about the weather, about the bay changing color between sunrise and noon, about the sound the stove made at 4 a.m. when quiet was so complete you could hear metal remembering. He told him nothing important. He discovered nothing was exactly what the silence needed. Kira relaxed by degrees, measured only in what she stopped doing. She no longer circled. Her attention narrowed to the door and the windows, the places where outside could reach inside. She claimed the space between stove and threshold with the authority of someone who had chosen her post and would not be explaining. On the second afternoon, a knock, 2 raps. confident without aggression. The knock of someone who had been announcing herself at doors for 68 years and had stopped worrying about whether company was wanted. Callum opened the door to a woman already mid-sentence. "I saw your headlights on the hill road last night. That road has one reason to be driven at 2 in the morning, and none of them are good." Marge Teller stood on his porch like she considered all porches her jurisdiction. 68, not tall, not short. Built with the solidity of decades carrying things heavier than they looked. Silver hair cut practical. Face lined at every place, a well-argued life leaves marks worn without apology as proof of attendance. Sharp blue eyes unimpressed by anything pretending to be more complicated than it was. She held a cast iron pot and a folded blanket. She did not ask if either was needed. She walked in, set the pot on the counter, placed the blanket on the chair, and evaluated the room with efficiency. Puppy, dog, medical report, man looking like someone who had not been visited in a long time and had not committed to the concept. "So," she said, "you've got a situation." "Temporary," Callum said. She looked at Kira, who had risen to a sit with considerable judgment. "Tell that to her. See what she thinks about temporary." She sat without invitation and offered history with the economy of someone who regarded personal information as practical courtesy. Husband Lloyd 8 years gone. Cancer fast once it moved. White house, green shutters, bottom of the hill. Garden that fought frost every year and mostly won. She stayed 30 minutes. At the door, one sentence without turning. "That dog didn't come to you by accident, Callum. Things that arrive through storms carry reasons. You just need to not close the door on it." She did not wait for a reply. That evening, Kira rose from her place and walked to the window facing the forest road. She stood there with ears forward, body still, attention fixed on a point down the road Callum could not identify. 4 minutes. Then she returned and lay down. Callum noted the time, said nothing. Next evening, same. Same window. Same hour. 4 minutes exactly. She was watching for something, and Callum had spent enough years alongside working dogs to know that when an animal watched a road with that kind of discipline, the road was going to answer. On the second night, it did. A vibration in the floorboards before any sound reached his ears. Kira's chest pressed to the wood, producing a growl so low it existed as physics rather than noise. A warning addressed not to Callum, but to whatever waited beyond the walls. He moved to the window, down the hill at the bend behind skeletal birch headlights. 2 points. Still and sharp. Not approaching. Not retreating. Present where presence required explanation and none was being offered. 1 minute. 2. Then gone. Not dimmed. Vanished. As if whatever watched from the road had completed its assessment and left without sharing results. He did not sleep easily. Morning brought clarity of the kind that only comes from looking at the ground. He walked the perimeter. Boot prints in the snow. Not his. Not Marge's. Unfamiliar tread circling at 10 feet, pausing at the window where firelight would have been visible, pausing at the corner nearest the road. Then retreating single file toward where the headlights had been. Someone had surveyed his cabin in the dark. Someone had measured windows and calculated distances and left without knocking. Not a visit. A reconnaissance. He memorized the print. Went inside. Moved his jacket to the chair beside the door. Boots to the threshold where they could be reached without crossing the room. Kira watched these rearrangements. She shifted her own body 6 inches closer to the door, matching his adjustment with her own. They understood each other. The knock came on the fifth day, mid-morning. Clear sky for the first time in a week, sunlight sharp and thin, turning the snow into a field of crushed glass that punished the eyes. The storm had retreated to the mountains where it sat on the peaks, like something resting between rounds, and the air that remained was so still and so bright, it felt like a held breath. Callum was rinsing the feeding bottle when two knocks traveled through the cabin door. Evenly spaced, rehearsed until they sounded casual the way certain lies are practiced until they pass for things the speaker just thought of. Kira was standing before the second knock finished. She placed herself between the stove where Scout slept and the center of the room, her body angled to cover both the door and the puppy without turning her head. She did not bark. She did not growl. She simply became the most important object in the room, and every line of her body communicated a single word that did not require translation and did not invite negotiation. No. He dried his hands, checked the window. A dark sedan at the edge of the drive, clean, polished, parked with the deliberate precision of someone who wanted the vehicle to be seen and wanted what the vehicle communicated money taste belonging to, arrived before the man who drove it. He opened the door. Darren Voss stood on the porch with a smile that had been engineered for exactly this kind of moment. It was not a warm smile. It was a smile that performed warmth, and the performance was polished by years of use in rooms where people needed to believe the man smiling at them had their interests in mind. He was mid-40s, tall, lean in the way of gym mirrors rather than physical labor, hair light brown styled despite the cold, each strand positioned with the kind of attention that costs money. Beard trimmed to a precise length along a jawline that worked hard at looking trustworthy, wool coat the color of wet stone, pressed slacks, leather gloves tucked into one pocket with the fingers arranged upward like a display. Everything about him said reasonable. Everything about him said control. "Afternoon," Darren said, smooth, calibrated. "Looking for my dogs. You're on private property." The smile held. Figured face-to-face would be easier. His eyes moved once past Callum's shoulder. Quick, cataloging, finding Kira inside. The smile widened. "There she is. Gave us a scare, girl." Kira's ears angled forward. She took one step, not toward Darren, toward the space between his gaze and the place where Scout lay. Her body made its statement without requiring sound. "What happened to the puppy?" Callum said. Not a question. Hand wave. Casual. Dismissive. Accident. Tumbled. Clumsy age. The shrug came too fast, a door closing before anyone could see the room behind it. "Glad someone found them. People don't break bones by panicking." Darren's eyes sharpened. The warmth stayed on his face, but rearranged itself from performing to watching. "You a vet?" "No, but I listen." The air between them changed weight. Darren sighed, the performance recalibrating, shifting from friendly to confiding, which was simply a different frequency of the same broadcast used by the same kind of man. "Look, I appreciate what you did, truly. But you don't have any right to keep them. They're registered. I have paperwork." "Then show me." Phone produced. Scrolling. Too much scrolling for a man who had come prepared. "Signal's bad up here. I'll send it." "You can leave without them," Callum said. "Or come back with documents. Those are your options." Scout stirred in his blanket. A thin sound escaped his throat. Not pain, just the small noise of a body still learning what safe felt like. Kira shifted backward 1 inch, shielding the puppy without breaking her line of sight to the door. Darren watched the movement. His gaze lingered. When he looked up, the performance had ended. What remained was patience. The particular patience that is not patience at all, but appetite, wearing patience like a coat it borrowed and does not intend to return. Keeping someone else's property is theft, he said. Quiet now. In this state, Callum said, animal cruelty supersedes ownership claims, and veterinary documentation carries legal weight. Thin laugh. The sound of a polished surface cracking. You think paper scares me? I think it does, quite a lot. 1 second. The mask slipped. Not far. Enough. The eyes of a man who had expected a door and found a wall and who was not accustomed to encountering walls because walls had always moved for him before. You don't know who you're dealing with. Kira took a single step forward. Not aggression, not threat. Declaration. A sentence delivered in a language that required no translation and permitted no appeal and offered no second reading. Darren's breath caught. He recovered quickly, the smile clicking back into position like something magnetic, but the backward step had already been taken and could not be retrieved. I'll be in touch, he said, already turning. Enjoy your rescue. He walked to the sedan without looking back. Engine started. Gravel crunched beneath tires that cost more than most people's groceries for a month. He departed with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed time had always belonged to him, and tonight would be no exception. Callum pressed his forehead against the closed door. 1 breath, 2, 3. The phone rang. Wren Hartwell. Her voice when he answered was clipped in a way that had nothing to do with bad signal and everything to do with the effort of keeping alarm contained inside professional language. Someone called my office, she said. 20 minutes ago. They asked about the puppy. They knew the intake time. They knew the injury specifics, the exact type of fracture, the displacement pattern. They were not family. She let the silence work. They did not leave a name, and when my receptionist asked for a callback number, the line went dead. Callum stood in the cabin with the phone pressed to his ear, and the fire crackling behind him, and the puppy breathing against the stove, and he felt something settle inside his chest that was not fear, but its quieter, more useful cousin. Recognition. The understanding that the shape of what he was standing inside had just changed dimensions. Boot prints in the snow that did not belong to anyone who lived on this hill. Headlights at the bend that watched without approaching. Darren Voss arriving at his door with a smile calibrated to the millimeter. And now a phone call containing clinical details that should not have been available to anyone who was not in that exam room on the night the puppy was brought in. The architecture was growing rooms faster than he could walk through them, and someone was already inside. Be careful, Callum, Wren said before she hung up. Whoever this is, they have access they shouldn't have. And they're not being subtle about letting us know. He set the phone down and looked at Kira. She was watching the door ears at half alert, her body angled the way it angled when she was processing rather than reacting. She had heard the tension in his voice. She had filed it. That afternoon at the feed store in town, a young man watched from the end of an aisle. 22, slim, canvas jacket a size too big, hanging loose across narrow shoulders. Boots that were newer than his confidence, the leather still stiff. He watched Callum select dog food with the tight expression of someone counting details for a report he did not want to file and could not afford to refuse. Callum approached, The young man flinched, but held his ground the way young men hold ground when the fear of staying is still marginally smaller than the fear of what happens if they run. Need something? Callum asked. No, I just... Eyes dropped to the bag of kibble. Came back up. You the one with Mr. Voss's dog. The name entered the air between them and stayed there, occupying more space than 2 syllables had any right to take. I have a dog, Callum said. She came to me. The young man nodded too many times the way people nod when their head is processing something. Their mouth is not yet willing to release. His mouth opened, closed. His left hand trembled at his side in a rhythm that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with the particular vibration that fear produces when it is trying to disguise itself as something else. Then he turned and walked out of the store with the urgent stride of someone who had just measured his distance from a fire and discovered it was considerably shorter than he had believed. Callum filed the jacket, the boots, the tremor. He paid for the food and drove up the hill into a silence that was no longer empty, but populated, filled with shapes and connections arranging themselves into a pattern he could nearly read, but could not yet name. The third night arrived wearing silence the way some people wear authority, completely, so that everything in the room adjusted without being asked. Callum stood at the kitchen sink, running water over a mug he had already cleaned. Cold water. Hands that did not register it. In the dark glass of the window, his reflection watched him with the expression he had spent 2 years avoiding. The face of a man who recognized what he saw and wished he did not. The burn scar on his wrist caught firelight. Pale against skin, darkened by years in countries where sun was not comfort but condition. That scar was earned in a room he no longer described. But the wound that truly ended him was earned here. On a road he passed every trip to town without looking, because looking changed nothing, and grief did not respond to attention. It only continued with or without an audience. Mara came the way she always came, without invitation, without resistance, present the way gravity is present, total and unavoidable, and so constant that you forget it is there until the moment it pulls you to the floor. The hospital room, not antiseptic, something heavier. The stillness of a space where the most important event had already happened and the machines continued because no one had told them it was over. Her dark hair on the pillow, her hands arranged by a nurse who understood the living needed the dead to look peaceful. The shape beneath the sheet, 7 months of a daughter who would never hear her mother's voice, never learn the particular laugh Mara produced when surprised, which was different from the laugh she produced when she expected to laugh, which Callum had been cataloging for 3 years and would never finish. He had promised to be back before the storm. The storm came early, or he came late. He spent 2 years trying to decide which, as if the answer would change the wait. It did not. The wait was the wait. 7 months along. A girl. No name settled yet. Mara leaned toward her grandmother's. Callum leaned toward whatever Mara chose because he had learned that some surrenders were not surrenders at all, but the recognition that the other person was right. He lost them both in the same hour. Same road. Same ice that formed because the temperature dropped faster than predicted. Time did not bargain. It passed. That was its only skill, and it practiced relentlessly. Pressure against his thigh. Kira. She had crossed the room on silent pause, and now stood with her shoulder pressed into his leg, not leaning, anchoring, drawing a border between where his mind had gone and where his body stood in a cabin where fire crackled and a puppy breathed and water ran over hands that had forgotten they held anything. Her amber eyes looked up. Not sympathy. Something older. The insistence of a living creature refusing to let another disappear into a room that existed only in memory. She pressed harder. The mug slipped, clattered. Water splashed. A fracture between then and now just wide enough for the present to reach through. Faucet off. Hands dried. He knelt and placed his palm flat against her ribcage. Her heart beat with a rhythm of purpose that had been running since the night she carried a broken life through a frozen town to the one door that opened. "I know," he said quietly. Not sure what he knew. Her ears softened half a degree. Confirmation enough. Evening brought Marge it for the second time. She did not knock. She opened the door, which in her philosophy was a promotion knocking being for strangers and salesmen. She carried nothing but herself. She sat by the fire. Kira adjusted her tail 2 inches. Neither spoke. The fire spoke for them. Scout slept curled into a comma, breathing deep enough to move blanket. "Lloyd used to sit in a chair like this," Marge said. "Not this chair. The chair in the White House, where a man she loved for 41 years sat every evening with a book he was not reading, present the way quiet men are present. Cancer, she said, without decoration. Because decoration did not change the word. Lloyd built furniture, read history, believed problems could be solved by staying until the problem got tired. When he died, Marge packed. South. Anywhere winter did not remind her time was passing. Lloyd's dog refused. Rosie. The name changed her voice, softened the edges. 12 years old. Arthritic. Mostly deaf. She sat on the porch in Lloyd's spot, and when I carried my suitcase to the car, she looked at me the way dogs look when they understand something you haven't figured out. She looked at Kira, at Callum. I stayed because of the dog. Then I realized the dog stayed because of me. We were each other's reason, and neither agreed to it, and it didn't matter because reasons don't require permission to be real. The fire filled the space where Callum's response would have been. Marge allowed it, understanding that some silences are full, and interrupting them is the same as interrupting a person hearing something they need to hear. Then her register dropped. Storytelling to something requiring careful handling. Last winter, a few dogs went missing around here. Not a wave. One from the Brennan property, one near the school. Old Mrs. Penny's terrier. Slow head shake. The conviction of 68 years learning the difference between what people said and what they meant. People said they wandered off, got lost. But dogs don't get lost when they have a home, Callum. Dogs know where home is better than we do. That is the entire point of dogs. The words settled into the room, heavy, patient, waiting. Callum looked at Kira, who every afternoon stood at the Forest Road window for 4 minutes watching something she did not share. Kira, whose left front paw still hovered before each step, carrying an old injury someone gave her in a place she could not name. Marge rose, hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, gone. Then the door fingers on the handle. Be careful with the overly kind ones in this town, Callum. Not everyone who smiles at a dog loves dogs. Door closed with the gentleness of a woman who knew the best warnings are delivered so softly the listener leans forward to hear, and in leaning commits to remembering. Callum sat in her warm chair, fire burning lower. Scout sighed in his blankets, the sound landing like a stone in still water. Kira rose, not to the door, not to the window. She crossed to the fireplace and stood beneath the photograph of Mara. Ears tilted, body still. Firelight on the dark saddle of her coat, the deep amber of her eyes. She looked at the frame the way she looked at everything that mattered, with assessment, reading it, deciding what it required. Then she lay down directly beneath it, chin on paws, positioned in the exact space below the frame, marking a boundary only she could see, guarding something only she understood needed guarding. Something shifted behind Callum's ribs. Not pain. Not the sharp grief he expected. Pressure less like breaking and more like movement, the way a frozen river sounds when ice remembers it was water once and might choose to be water again. He had told himself he did not believe in signs. He believed in timing, training, cause and consequence. The universe was not a post office, but Kira's stillness beneath that photograph felt like an answer to a question he had not allowed himself to ask. Whether the door he closed after the funeral still had a handle on the inside, whether on the other side there might be something built on ground where grief had stood the way new wood grows where forest burned, not replacing what was lost, but proving the soil still works. He did not speak to Mara. He sat in the quiet and let the question exist because some questions did their best work open, like doors, like wounds, like the distance between a man who learned to survive and a man beginning to suspect survival was never enough, and that the dog beneath his wife's photograph knew this better than he did. Fire burned to ash. Scout shifted and made a sound that was not pain, but contentment. A sound Callum had never heard in this cabin, a sound that changed the room. Outside, the sky held its cold. Below the hill, a sedan moved north on the coast road. Darren Voss on the phone. Short conversation. The voice on the other end, older measured, accustomed to instructions, followed without question. One question asked, one answer given. Headlights vanished toward the old logging dock at the lake edge where a tin building crouched in trees, like a secret kept so long it had stopped thinking of itself as hidden. In the cabin, Kira lifted her head and turned toward the forest road window, ears forward. Breathing changed. Not faster, focused. 4 minutes. Exactly 4. Then she lowered her head and slept with one ear toward the road. She would do this again tomorrow. Same hour. Same direction. Until the thing she had been counting arrived and the pattern completed the shape she had known it would reach since the first night she stood at that window and listened to something moving in the dark that the man beside her could not yet hear. Callum Rourke sat in the last booth of the Harbor Bend diner with his back to the wall, a habit that had survived 2 combat deployments and 2 years of grief, and showed no signs of retiring. The vinyl was cracked along the seams, repaired with tape the color of old skin. The counter smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long and fryer oil that had been used too many times, and the fluorescent light above the register hummed at a frequency that most people stopped hearing after the first minute, and that Callum would hear for as long as he sat there because his nervous system did not believe in tuning things out. He had ordered coffee he did not intend to drink. The mug sat between his hands, warming his palms, serving its real purpose. Deputy Holt Mercer arrived at the end of his shift the way he always arrived, slowly, heavily, with the particular fatigue of a man who had spent 30 years watching a small town pretend its problems did not exist, and had grown tired not of the watching, but of the pretending. Late 40s. Stocky without softness, shoulders rounded by decades of winter gear and long shifts. hair graying at the temples kept short, mustache trimmed out of duty rather than style, eyes steady and tired, the kind of tired that came from knowing exactly how many things went wrong quietly in a place where everyone smiled at the grocery store and talked about weather as though weather were the only thing that ever happened. He saw Callum and recognition crossed his face the way weather crosses a bay visible before it arrives. He slid into the booth, wrapped his hands around a mug the waitress brought without being asked, and listened. Callum laid it out. The visit from Darren Voss' polished coat and practiced smile, the shift from charm to threat when charm failed. The phone call to Wren's clinic from someone who knew details they should not have known and left no name. The boot prints circling the cabin in darkness. The headlights at the bend that watched and vanished. Holt did not interrupt. He stared into his coffee, the way men stare into fires looking for shapes in the dark that might rearrange themselves into answers if given patience. "There are rumors," he said finally, low, measured. Every word chosen the way a man on thin ice chooses steps. Nothing solid. Dogs taken in for rehoming through channels that look legitimate until you look twice. Paperwork clean enough to pass a glance. Then the animals vanish. Folks don't ask questions because the truth makes neighbors into accomplices, and because the people behind it know how to keep their hands looking clean. He met Callum's eyes. Voss is respected here. Sponsors community events. Sits on the board. Shakes hands at the church fundraiser, and people believe he's generous because generosity is easier to believe than the alternative. You come at him without proof that stands in a room full of people who like him, and you become the problem, not him. "What kind of proof?" Callum said. "The kind that doesn't care whether people like the person it's about. Documentation. Physical evidence. Testimony from someone willing to put their name down and not take it back when pressure comes." Holt paused, drank, set the mug down. "You find that, bring it to me. But understand that a man like Voss doesn't operate alone. There are people above him, and the ones above are the ones who concern me." Callum thanked him and left without finishing his coffee. The cold hit clean after the diner's stale warmth, and the sky above the harbor was the color of a bruise that had not decided whether it was healing or worsening. That afternoon, Callum walked the cabin perimeter with his thermos in hand and Kira at his side. She moved with her nose low steps, efficient, covering ground the way professionals do, without waste, without distraction. When she stopped, it was abrupt enough to halt him without thought. One section of fence wire near the tree line. Body angled forward. Ears locked. Callum crouched and followed her gaze. The tracker was small and black and ugly in its simplicity. No larger than a matchbox clinging to the metal with a magnet, a faint seam along its edge suggesting weather resistance. He did not touch it immediately. He scanned the trees, the road, the quality of the air, reading the space the way he had been trained to read spaces that could hurt you. Then he pulled on gloves and pried it free. The magnet released with a click, too soft to be reassuring. He turned it in his hand, felt the weight of intention. Someone had walked to this fence in the dark, fixed this device, and walked away, believing the man in the cabin would never think to check. They were wrong about that. They would be wrong about other things. Inside, he set the tracker on the table beside the medical report. Metal and paper, surveillance and documentation. Two kinds of truth staring at each other across wood. The knock came an hour later. Not Darren. Sawyer. The young man stood on the porch looking like he had not slept in days. Canvas jacket zipped to the chin, hands deep in pockets, eyes moving constantly checking the road, the trees, the windows, as if every surface had become a place where something might be watching. "I'm not here," he said. Fast. Rehearsed. The kind of statement someone makes when the argument with themselves has not been resolved, but the body has overruled the mind and carried itself to the door. Callum waited. Waiting was a weapon he had used longer than any other. Sawyer's jaw worked, eyes to the porch boards. When he spoke, his voice was lower, afraid, but present. "He's got a place, near the old logging dock by the lake. I've been driving stuff there for him. 6 months. Boxes, supplies. I didn't ask what was inside because he pays cash, and I needed the work, and asking felt like a door I couldn't close once I opened it." He looked up, met Callum's eyes for the first time. "But I saw things. Cages. Medicine bottles with labels I couldn't read. Collars that didn't have dogs attached to them anymore." His voice cracked, not from sadness, from the specific shame of a person who watched something wrong happen from close enough to touch it and chose to look away until looking away stopped working. "I just drove the truck. That's what I told myself. But I know what that means. It means you already know." Callum nodded once. No comfort offered, no judgment. Both would have been noise, and what this moment required was the specific silence that says, "I heard you, and I will remember what you said." Sawyer left fast. Head down, but lighter by the weight of a confession that had been sitting in his chest longer than he knew. Callum watched him go and understood that the young man had just done 2 things at once. He had given Callum a location, and he might also have given Darren a warning that someone was talking. Whether Sawyer would hold under pressure or collapse under it was a question that could not be answered from a porch. It would be answered later in a room that had not yet been built by a version of Sawyer that had not yet been tested. The tracker sat on the table, the report beside it. And now, a location spoken once into cold air and already dissolving into the plausible deniability of a young man who could claim he had never been here. Callum looked at Kira. She was watching the road again. Same window, same hour, same 4 minutes. But today, she did something different. Before walking to the window, she stopped, turned back, pressed her nose briefly to Scout's blanket, the gesture so small and so deliberate it could have been dismissed as nothing. Then she continued to her post. It was not nothing. It was a check, a decision made and confirmed, and it landed in Callum's chest with a weight that had nothing to do with the gesture's size and everything to do with what it meant. She was making sure. Before she went to watch for whatever was coming, she was making sure the thing she had carried through the storm was still safe. He followed her to the glass. The road was empty. The trees held still. The quiet felt staged, like a room that had been cleaned too recently, where the absence of disorder was itself a kind of disorder. He told himself that was training talking. He did not move from the window until she did. The next morning, Kira led. Not with urgency, with certainty. She moved down the forest road with her nose low and her tail level, ignoring every distraction of scent and sound that the woods offered, cutting through the noise of the natural world the way a blade cuts through rope, with focus that was not learned but inherited, carried in blood and bone from generations of dogs who had been bred to find things that did not want to be found. Callum followed with Scout strapped against his chest in the canvas sling. The puppy's weight was small, but constant, a warm pressure over his heart that served as a reminder with every step of what was at stake and what had already been paid for the right to take these steps at all. Wren had approved the wait for short outings. Scout slept through most of it, his body surrendering to the motion the way infants surrender to car rides, the rhythm of walking, replacing the need for vigilance with something older and more trustworthy. Kira cut off the road near the old timber spur and headed toward the lake. The snow here was different, tracked by tires in patterns that were too regular to be recreational, packed in lanes that suggested vehicles came and went with a frequency that had nothing to do with the abandoned logging operation whose rusted signs still stood along the fence like headstones for an industry the forest had already begun to reclaim. She stopped at a drift piled against a half-buried fence line. The drift was too even, too deliberate, shaped by hands rather than wind. Callum knelt and brushed the surface layer with his glove. The first thing he found was a collar. Leather. Cracked. Buckle twisted. Then another. And another. Each one different. Each one abandoned. A few steps further, half buried in frozen soil plastic fragments. Microchip casings snapped open, the tiny glass capsules that should have been inside them gone. Someone had taken the time to remove identities. Not in haste, with method. The dock warehouse crouched at the edge of the trees like a memory nobody wanted to claim. Tin siding rusted through in places. Doors hanging slightly off, true, the gap between them wide enough to suggest that whatever happened inside happened often enough that proper closure was not worth the effort. Callum eased the main door open. The smell arrived first. Chemical. Sharp. The particular sharpness of sedatives, a smell he recognized from veterinary contexts, but that had no business being this strong in a building that was supposed to be empty. The space inside was divided by temporary fencing into narrow runs. Steel cages lined one wall, their floors scarred with marks that could only have been made by claws moving in patterns that had nothing to do with play and everything to do with panic. On a folding table sat paperwork weighted down with a wrench, shipping invoices, transfer logs, destinations across state lines, names of buyers that meant nothing to Callum but would mean something to someone whose job it was to make names mean something. Everything was methodical. Everything was recent. Kira did not enter the building. She stopped at the door and stood there, her body rigid, her breathing shallow, reading the space with senses that went beyond smell into something Callum could not name but could recognize. She was not afraid. She was remembering. Her left front paw lifted from the ground and hung there, the old injury announcing itself not from cold this time, but from something else entirely. On the folding table beneath the shipping logs, Callum found a second stack of papers. Older. The edges soft from handling. Transfer records dating back further than the recent operation documenting animals moved through a system that used the language of rescue to disguise the mechanics of commerce. Adoption fees. Rehoming agreements. Veterinary clearances signed by clinics in towns 3 counties away. And then a photograph. It was clipped to a transfer form with a rusted paper clip, the image faded but clear enough to read. A German shepherd, younger and smaller than the dog, standing at the door but unmistakable in the architecture of her face, the set of her ears, the particular way her front legs carried weight. She stood beside a family. A man. A woman. 2 children young, both with their hands on the dog's back, both smiling with the uncomplicated joy of children who believe that the things they love will always be there. The transfer form was dated 3 years ago. The family's name was printed at the top. The receiving party was listed as a regional rescue organization that Callum had never heard of. The signature at the bottom of the form belonged to a name he had heard: Darren Voss. Callum looked at the photograph. He looked at the dog standing at the door. He looked at the space between the photograph and the dog, the 3 years of distance that separated the animal in the image from the animal on the threshold, and he understood. Kira had not wandered to Darren Voss by accident. She had been taken, removed from a family that loved her through paperwork that looked legitimate and a system that functioned precisely because it wore the face of compassion. The old injury on her front left leg was not from a fall. It was from the first transport. The first time she had been loaded into a vehicle by hands she did not know and carried to a place she had not chosen. She had been a victim of the same machine she had led him to. She had not come through the storm carrying her broken puppy to any door. She had come to this door, to the man who opened it, because she was not just saving Scout. She was breaking the cycle. She was ending the loop that began 3 years ago when someone with clean paperwork and a reasonable smile took her from people who were still looking for her and placed her inside a system that treated living things as inventory. Callum stood in the warehouse with the photograph in one hand and the weight of comprehension settling into his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. Scout shifted against him, sighing in his sleep, unaware that the building around them contained the machinery of the world that had hurt him and the proof that the world was larger and older and more organized than a single man with a single boot. Kira turned her head from the doorway and looked at the photograph in his hand. She did not approach. She did not whine. She looked at it the way she had looked at Mara's photograph on the mantel, with stillness, with recognition. Then she turned back to the trees and resumed her watch. He pocketed what he could without disturbing the rest. The photograph, 2 shipping invoices, 1 transfer log with Darren's signature. He did not take everything. The goal was not to be brave. The goal was to be right. Evidence that disappeared completely was evidence that could be denied completely. Evidence that remained in place but had been documented was evidence that could speak twice. He shut the door softly, stepped back toward the tree line. Kira went rigid. The vibration came before the sound. An engine. Close. Moving slowly. The particular slowness of a vehicle that is not looking for a parking space, but for confirmation. Callum dropped into the trees, held Scout against his chest, felt the puppy's heartbeat through the fabric fast and small, and trusting in a way that made his own heart tighten with something that was not fear, but its opposite, the fierce, unreasonable determination to ensure that the heartbeat continued. Kira pressed to his leg, silent, steady, her body against his the way a wall stands against wind, not with effort, but with a simple refusal to be somewhere else. The vehicle rolled to a stop by the dock. Not marked, not cautious. 2 men stepped out, silhouettes in heavy coats, their movements efficient in the way of people performing a task they had performed before and did not expect to be observed performing. They went straight to the warehouse. Lights flickered on inside. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed through the trees. Boxes being moved. Cages being folded. The systematic dismantling of a room that someone had decided needed to not exist anymore. They were clearing it. Fast. Professional. Removing the evidence of an operation that had just become a liability. Callum watched from cover with the discipline of a man who understood that being seen was not the same as being useful, and that the papers in his jacket were worth more than any confrontation the trees could provide. He counted the men. 2. He noted the vehicle. Dark. No plates visible from this angle. He noted the time. He noted the direction the wind was blowing, because wind carried sound and sound carried information, and information was the only currency that would matter when this reached a room with a judge. 20 minutes. The lights went off. The men returned to the vehicle. Doors closed. The engine started. Tires moved over frozen ground, and then the sound folded into the forest and was gone. Callum waited 3 full minutes after the silence settled before he moved. Then he stood adjusted Scout in the sling and began the walk back up the hill. The sky was bruising toward dusk. The temperature was dropping, with the light each degree falling like a page turned in a book that was heading toward a chapter no one wanted to read. The cabin appeared at the top of the hill, its single window catching the last copper of the sun, holding it like a promise it was not sure it could keep. Inside, Callum set the photograph on the table. He placed it beside the tracker and the medical report. 3 objects: metal paper and a faded image of a dog standing with a family that was still missing her. 3 pieces of a truth that had been buried under snow and commerce, and the willingness of a town to look away, because looking hurt more than ignorance, and ignorance was free. He looked at Kira. She was lying between the door and the stove chin on her paws, eyes open, watching him the way she watched everything, with patience that was not passive, but loaded the patience of someone who has seen the full shape of a thing and is waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. He understood now why she stood at the window every afternoon at the same hour. She was not watching for danger. She was watching for the road to deliver what she knew it would eventually deliver. She had been counting the way animals count, not in numbers, but in the rhythms of a world that moved in patterns, and she had known before he did that the pattern was closing. Outside, the forest road lay empty, but empty, Callum had learned, was just another word for waiting. And the thing the road was waiting to deliver was no longer a question. It was an appointment, the kind that arrives whether you are ready or not. The evidence in his jacket pressed against his ribs. The photograph rested on the table. The puppy breathed against the warmth of the stove. And somewhere down the hill, in a building that was now empty and clean and scrubbed of everything except the scratches on the floor that could not be scrubbed, because steel remembers what has stood on it, even when the standing is over, the truth remained. Not as proof. Not yet. As a scar. And scars, Callum knew better than most, did not need permission to tell their story. They told it every time the light touched them, whether anyone was listening or not. The second storm arrived without drama. No wall of wind. No cinematic announcement. Just a steady pressure that settled over the town like a hand placed flat on a table, firm and deliberate and patient in the way that only things capable of killing you are patient. Snow came sideways, then down, then sideways again, the kind that found seams in clothing and gaps in walls, and turned small failures into lethal ones. By dusk, the lights along the bay flickered. By nightfall, the power thinned to a fragile pulse that could not decide whether to stay or go. Then it went. The cabin dropped into honest darkness. No hum of electricity behind the walls. No digital glow from the clock on the counter. Just the fire in the stove and the silence that rushed in to fill the space where noise had been the way water rushes into a hole dug in sand instantly and completely, as if the silence had been waiting outside the whole time, and the power had simply been keeping the door closed. Callum Rourke moved through the darkness with the economy of a man who had trained for years to operate in conditions where light was a luxury and sound was a liability. He fed the stove just enough to hold temperature without advertising the cabin's presence. Lanterns staged at 3 points in the room, but lit to their lowest setting, positioned low to the floor, where their glow would not reach the windows. Scout was secured in the canvas sling against his chest, the puppy's warmth small and stubborn and real. A heartbeat pressed against his own that counted time in a rhythm faster than his, but moving in the same direction. Kira paced the perimeter once, twice, then stopped short behind the cabin near the back wall where the stove's exhaust pipe ran through the boards and disappeared into shadow. She did not bark. She did not rush. She stood with her head low and her ears forward, and her body aimed at the ground with a precision that Callum had learned to trust more than instruments, more than briefings, more than any information that arrived through channels designed by humans. She was reading something in the earth or in the air or in the space between them, and whatever she was reading had caused her to stop and stay stopped, and turn her entire body into an arrow pointing at a single location. Callum followed her with a flashlight he kept aimed low. The exhaust line ran along the back of the cabin, a dull pipe that bent once and entered the crawl space beneath the floor. Kira pawed at the snow near the junction point. Once. Precise. Restrained. Then she stepped back and looked at him. He knelt and brushed the surface away. The smell came first. Faint. Wrong. Gas not enough to announce itself in the open air, but enough. Enough to accumulate inside a sealed cabin during a storm when every window is shut and every crack is blocked against the cold. Enough to build slowly in the blood while a man sleeps, while a puppy sleeps, while a dog stands guard at a door that is protecting against the wrong direction. Someone had fitted a simple clamp near the exhaust junction, loosened it just enough to create a gap that would bleed carbon monoxide into the crawl space, and from there into the cabin through the floor. No timer, no device, no evidence of anything except where. The kind of failure that would be found after the storm by a neighbor or a deputy who would shake his head and write it up as maintenance neglected during a hard winter, a tragedy, not a crime, because the dead cannot testify about the smell they did not notice, and the clamp they did not check, and the hands that loosened it in the dark while the snow covered every footprint within the hour. Callum shut the valve, tightened the coupling with a wrench from his belt pouch, bled the line safely into the open air, and held his breath while the gas dispersed into wind that carried it away without comment. He did not hurry. He did not swear. He finished the job the way he finished every job that mattered, with the controlled precision of a man who understood that the distance between dying and not dying was often a quarter turn of a wrench, and the instinct of a dog who refused to stop reading the world, even when the world was trying to kill her. He sat back on his heels in the snow, exhaled. The breath fogged and vanished. Kira leaned in and pressed her shoulder against his leg. Not praise. Acknowledgement. The gesture of a partner who has completed a task and is confirming that the task is complete before moving to the next one. Inside the cabin was dark and cold and honest. Callum relit the lanterns, checked Scout, breathing steady, checked the stove draft, clean. He set the medical report and the tracker and the photograph from the warehouse on the table where he could see them in the low light. Evidence did not keep you alive. Timing did. He stood at the counter with his hands flat on the wood and felt the old argument begin. The one that had lived in his chest since Mara died and had won every round since. The voice that said, "Close the door. Walk away. Do not attach yourself to anything that can be taken, because everything can be taken, and the taking is what kills you. Not the loss itself, but the space. The loss leaves behind the room that stays furnished with someone else's absence for the rest of your life." He had listened to that voice for 2 years. He had obeyed it. He had built a cabin on a hill and filled it with discipline and silence and the careful management of a grief he would not release. Because releasing it felt like releasing her, and he could not release her, and so the grief stayed, and the silence stayed, and the door stayed closed. Scout shifted against his chest. A small sound, not pain, trust, the sound of a creature who had learned in the space of 8 days that the man holding him would not put him down, and who had decided on the basis of that evidence that the world was a place where being held was possible. Kira stood by the stove and looked at him. Amber eyes steady, not asking, not pleading, present. The same way Mara used to look at him across a room full of people finding him without searching, knowing where he was without checking the look that said, "I see you and I am not leaving, and you do not have to explain why you need me to stay because I already know." The argument in his chest did not end. It simply lost, not to logic, not to courage, to the weight of a puppy breathing against his heart, and a dog who had carried that puppy through a storm to his door because she had decided with the certainty of an animal who does not second-guess instinct that he was the one who would open it. He picked up his phone, typed one message to Holt Mercer, coordinates of the cabin, name of Darren Voss, summary of evidence, description of the exhaust line. Send. He set the phone face down on the table and did not check whether the message went through because in the middle of a storm with failing signal, the only thing worse than not sending the message was staring at the screen, waiting for confirmation that would either come or not come, regardless of how hard he stared. Marge called. The signal cut in and out her voice, arriving in fragments that he assembled into meaning the way you assemble a puzzle, in bad light by shape rather than image. Callum, static. Heard engines, static. On the hill road, static. More than one, static. Be careful. The line died. The screen went dark. The cabin was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something is about to happen and the room knows it before the people inside do. He looked at Kira. She had already turned from the stove and was facing the front door. Ears forward, weight balanced. Her coat caught the lantern light along the saddle of her back, the dark fur absorbing the glow rather than reflecting it, so that she appeared less like an animal standing in a room and more like a shadow that had decided to become solid. She was reading the night through wood and glass with senses that operated on frequencies he could not access, but had learned to trust the way he trusted the ground beneath his boots. Not because it had explained itself, but because it had never failed him. The sound of tires on frozen ground reached him through the walls. One vehicle, then another. Engines cutting off in sequence the way engines cut off when drivers have agreed in advance on arrival protocol. Doors opening softly. The crunch of boots on snow deliberate unhurried the footsteps of people who believed they had the advantage of darkness and were taking their time with it. Then the knock came. Slow, measured, confident. The knock of a man who had knocked on this door before and expected it to matter more this time. The knock of a man who had tried charm and tried patience and tried a gas line loosened in the dark and was now trying the last thing in his inventory, which was presence, the simple physical fact of standing on someone's porch with people behind him and making it clear that the conversation he wanted was going to happen whether the door opened or not. Darren Voss's voice slid through the wood like something that had been practicing for this moment its entire life. "Callum, we need to talk." Callum did not answer. He shifted Scout from the chest sling into the padded carrier and slid it across the floor to the far wall, away from the door, away from the windows into the corner, where the stone of the fireplace met the log of the wall and created a pocket of shadow and solidity that was as close to safe as geometry could provide. Kira repositioned without sound. She placed herself between the carrier and the center of the room, her body low her head level, every muscle loaded with a stillness that was more dangerous than movement, because movement announced intention and stillness concealed it. Outside, a second voice murmured, male, older. The cadence of someone accustomed to giving instructions in environments where instructions were followed without repetition or question. Warren. Callum had not heard the voice before, but he recognized its architecture. Command voice. The voice of the man above Darren, the one Holt had warned about, the one who concerned him more than the man doing the smiling. The door handle turned. Tested once gently. Tested again. Last chance, Darren said. The smile was audible in his voice, which was a remarkable achievement given the circumstances, and said everything about the man that needed to be said. He could stand outside a locked cabin in a blizzard threatening someone who had evidence of his crimes and still sound like he was doing you a favor by giving you the opportunity to cooperate. Headlights appeared at the bend in the road below. A second vehicle pulling in behind the first. Lights off as it stopped. Doors opened. The crunch of boots on frozen ground multiplied. Callum counted without numbers the way his body counted by the weight and rhythm of footsteps translated through snow into the structure of the porch, into the floor, into the soles of his feet. 3, maybe 4. Shadows moved past the windows. Someone tested the back door. A flashlight beam swept the side of the cabin and vanished. Then glass cracked at the back window sharp and sudden, the sound of a fist or an elbow testing whether the night could be let in by force. Callum stood in the dark center of his home with his hands at his sides and his breathing controlled and the old calm settling into him the way it always settled, not as peace, but as clarity. The removal of everything that was not the present moment, the stripping away of fear and memory and the future, until all that remained was the geometry of the room and the positions of the people in it and the distance between where he stood and where he needed to be. Kira did not move. She did not need to. She was already where she needed to be. Scout made a small sound from the carrier, not distress. The opposite, the murmur of a creature who had been warm and held and was now in shadow, but was not afraid because the shadow contained the scent of the man who held him and the presence of the dog who carried him, and both of those things meant safety in a language older than words. Callum waited. The seconds passed with the weight of stones dropped into water, each one sending ripples through the dark that only he and Kira could feel. Then light. Not from the cabin, from the road. Blue light rotating, cutting through the snow in arcs that painted the trees in alternating color and shadow. The light did not rush. It arrived with the deliberate pace of authority, that has been summoned and has decided to answer. Deputy Holt Mercer's cruiser rolled into the drive with restraint rather than speed. A second unit followed. Then a third, this one bearing state markings its presence, heavier, more official, carrying the particular weight of jurisdiction that extends beyond a single town and a single deputy's patience. Doors opened. Voices rose into the storm calm and clipped the professional shorthand of men and women who had been trained to manage chaos by refusing to participate in it. Names were spoken aloud. Commands were issued with the quiet efficiency of people who expected compliance and were prepared for the alternative. Holt stepped into the circle of lantern light that spilled from the cabin's porch. His shoulders were squared. His face was set. He looked older in the cold, more solid, as if the temperature had compressed him into a denser version of himself. "Evening," he said. "Hands where we can see them." Darren Voss's expression performed several transformations in rapid sequence. Surprise first, because the arrival of law enforcement was not part of the evening he had planned. Then calculation, because men like Darren did not stop calculating even when the numbers had turned against them. Then the smile reassembling itself from muscle memory, because the smile was the last tool in the box, and he would use it until someone took it from him. "Deputy, this is a misunderstanding. I came to check on my animals, and this man has been holding them against my will. I have paperwork that shows clear owner." "We'll start with the exhaust line," Holt said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He gestured toward the back of the cabin where the loose clamp still hung from the pipe like a confession. "And we'll keep going." Warren stood beside the sedan, silver hair catching the blue light, eyes sharp and still scanning the scene with the detached efficiency of a man who was already calculating exits and finding none. He said nothing. He watched the way a chess player watches a board that has turned against him, not with anger, but with the cold recognition that the game had entered a phase he had not anticipated, and the moves remaining were limited. They searched the vehicles. Callum stood on the porch and watched and did not feel triumph, because triumph was an emotion for people who believed that winning was an event rather than a process. And he knew that what was happening in the driveway was not an ending, but a beginning, the first page of a chapter that would be written in courtrooms and offices, and the slow grinding machinery of a system that moved at its own pace, regardless of how urgently anyone wanted it to move faster. The search produced what he expected and what he hoped it would not. Sedatives in a case designed to look like a first aid kit. Blank collars, cash sealed in envelopes with no names, burner phones, 3 of them, their screens dark, their contacts deleted their existence, a confession in plastic and glass. Darren protested, loudly at first, with the polished indignation of a man who had practiced being wronged. Then with less conviction as the evidence multiplied and the narrative he was constructing collapsed under its own contradictions. By the time the cuffs closed around his wrists, the protest had thinned to a mechanical repetition of phrases that his lawyer would later improve upon, but that in this moment, in this snow under these lights, sounded exactly like what they were. The words of a man who had run out of performance and was left with only the raw material of a personality that had never been tested by a situation it could not charm or purchase its way through. Warren was different. Warren was detained and questioned and released with a promise from the state investigators that felt less like a promise and more like a placeholder. There was not enough direct evidence to hold him. Not yet. His hands had remained clean the way hands remain clean when other people do the touching. He stood beside the cruiser while the officers processed the scene, and his eyes moved once to the cabin window where Kira's shape was visible in the lantern glow, and something in his expression shifted by a degree so small that only someone trained to read faces in low light would have caught it. Recognition. Not of the dog. Of the situation. Of the fact that the architecture of what he had built was now visible to people whose job it was to dismantle such architecture, and that visibility, once achieved, could not be reversed. He got into the cruiser without being told. The door closed. The vehicle pulled away into the storm. Sawyer arrived last. Not in a car. On foot, walking up the hill road with snow in his hair and his canvas jacket zipped to his chin and his hands in his pockets and his face carrying the particular expression of a young man who has done the hardest thing he has ever done and is not yet sure whether it was brave or stupid, and suspects it might be both. He had gone to Holt before the storm worsened. He had brought his phone. On it, a recording. Darren Voss's voice giving instructions to clear the warehouse. Names. Dates. Details spoken with the careless confidence of a man who did not believe the person on the other end of the call had the courage to betray him. Darren had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about several things tonight, and the night was not finished teaching him. Holt took the phone, logged it, looked at Sawyer with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a tired man who has spent decades waiting for someone in this town to step forward and has just watched a 22-year-old kid do what 40 years of adults had failed to do. "You did right," Holt said. Sawyer nodded. He did not look like he believed it yet. He would. Later. When the shaking stopped and the understanding settled and the weight of what he had carried for 6 months was finally someone else's problem. But not tonight. Tonight he just looked young and cold and scared, and standing, which was enough. Standing was always enough. Inside the cabin, the sound of engines faded. The blue light withdrew from the walls. The snow reclaimed the silence it had briefly lost. Kira did not relax until the last vibration of the last vehicle disappeared from the frequency range that only she could hear. Then she turned from the door, walked to the carrier in the corner, lowered herself beside Scout, touched her nose to the top of his head. The puppy sighed. Callum sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The fire had burned low. The lanterns cast shadows that moved with the draft. The evidence was still on the table. The photograph of Kira with a family that loved her sat beside the tracker and the medical report, 3 objects that together told a story the town would have to decide whether it wanted to hear. Warren was free. The name above Darren's name had walked out of a police cruiser and into the night, and the night had absorbed him the way nights absorb all things that prefer not to be seen. The system was damaged, but not destroyed. The head had been cut from one neck, but the body had other necks, and bodies like that did not die from a single cut. But the door was open, and through it, enough light had entered to illuminate what had been hidden. And illumination, once it touches, a thing does not leave simply because someone wishes it would. Callum looked at Kira. She was watching him from beside Scout with amber eyes that held no expectation and no judgment and no request. Only the steady, ancient patience of a creature who had carried her broken child through a frozen world to find the one human willing to look at what she was showing him and not turn away. He did not turn away. He had not turned away since the night she stood on his porch and met his eyes and showed him something he did not yet have words for, but was beginning to understand. Some doors, once opened, do not close again, and the man who opens them is not the same man who stood on the other side. Outside, the storm eased by 1 degree. Inside, the puppy breathed. And somewhere between those two facts, in the narrow space where the cold met the warm and neither one something that had been frozen for a very long time, began slowly to move. Morning came without ceremony. The storm withdrew the way storms always withdraw quietly, leaving the work behind for people to finish. Snow softened along the bay, its surface breaking into plates that shifted and settled against one another like pieces of a conversation that had been interrupted and was now trying to find its way back to the point. The sky opened in pale strips above the ridge, not blue yet, but no longer the pressed gray of the previous days. A sky that was deciding what it wanted to be, and had not yet committed, but was leaning toward something lighter. The cabin held warmth that no longer felt borrowed. The fire had been fed through the night by a man who did not sleep and did not try to, a man who sat at the table with evidence arranged before him and a dog at his feet and a puppy breathing against the stove, and understood that what had happened in the darkness was not the end of something, but the beginning of a process that would move at its own speed and answer to no one's impatience. The state vehicles arrived later. 2 sedans and a van, measured and unhurried, carrying the weight of jurisdiction that extended beyond a single town. Papers moved from clipboards to tables. Questions were asked twice and answered once. Callum sat at his kitchen table and gave a gray-haired investigator everything: the medical report, the GPS tracker, the photograph of Kira with a family that was not Darren's clipped to a transfer form bearing his signature, the warehouse invoices, the timeline of surveillance, the exhaust line loosened to kill quietly. The investigator set her pen down. You understand this will take time, months. The people above Voss will hire attorneys who specialize in making evidence look less convincing than it is. I understand, Callum said. He had spent 20 years in a profession that taught the difference between a battle and a campaign, and campaigns were won by the people who showed up the most mornings. By noon, a temporary custody order sat on his table. The dogs were to remain where they were safe. Callum read each page with the attention of a man who had learned that precision was the most honest form of communication. He did not celebrate. Outside, Kira lay on the porch boards with her chin on her paws and her eyes half closed. Wind lifted her fur and set it down again. She looked like a guard who trusted the watch, like a soldier who had completed a mission and was resting not because the world was safe, but because she had done what she could with what she had, and the next shift belonged to someone else. The call came in the afternoon. Wren Hartwell, her voice carrying a warmth that moved beneath the professional surface like a current beneath ice. The family, she said, from the photograph, the transfer records you found. I ran the microchip data from the old files against the National Registry. The family's name is Colton. David and Rachel Colton, 2 kids. They reported Kira stolen 3 years ago. They've been looking for her since. They filed with every database, every rescue network, every lost dog registry in 3 states. They never stopped. Callum stood in his kitchen holding the phone and looking through the window at Kira on the porch. 3 years. 3 years of a family checking websites and calling shelters and driving to adoption events hoping to see a face they recognized. 3 years of a dog being moved through a system designed to erase her identity and sell her forward. 3 years of distance created by one man's signature on one form that had been designed to look like compassion. "They want to come," Wren said. "They want to see her." Callum closed his eyes. He knew what this meant. He had known it since the moment he found the photograph in the warehouse and understood its weight. Keeping Kira was not an option he had the right to choose. She belonged to people who had loved her first and had never stopped and had spent 3 years in the specific agony of not knowing whether the thing they loved was alive or dead, or suffering or forgotten. "Tell them to come," he said. They arrived 2 days later. A blue truck pulling into the drive with the careful speed of people who had been disappointed before and were protecting themselves against the possibility of being disappointed again. David Colton was tall and quiet, the kind of man whose nervousness expressed itself as stillness rather than movement. Rachel was smaller, dark-haired, her eyes already wet before she opened the truck door because she had been crying on and off for 2 days since the call and had stopped trying to manage it. The children stayed in the back seat, faces pressed to the glass, too young to understand the full architecture of what had happened, but old enough to remember a dog and to want her back with the uncomplicated ferocity that only children bring to wanting. Kira was on the porch when they arrived. She stood up. Her ears came forward. Her nose worked the air, pulling information from the breeze that carried the scent of 4 people she had not smelled in 3 years, but had not forgotten, because dogs do not forget the scent of the people who love them. That information is stored in a place that paperwork cannot reach, and time cannot erode, and distance cannot dilute. Her tail moved. Not the controlled, purposeful movement Callum had come to know. Something different. Something that came from a deeper place. A tail moving because the body remembered joy before the mind had finished processing what the joy was about. Rachel stepped out of the truck and stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth. David stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and his jaw set against the specific kind of emotion that men who are not accustomed to crying experience as a physical force in the chest that must be held in place by the muscles of the face. Kira looked at them. She looked at Callum. She looked at the door of the cabin where Scout lay sleeping beside the stove. Then she did the thing that broke every heart in the driveway and healed most of them at the same time. She walked to Callum. She sat beside him. She pressed her shoulder into his leg the way she had pressed it that night at the sink when he was drowning in a memory, and she had pulled him back. She looked up at him with amber eyes that held no confusion and no conflict, only clarity. The clarity of a creature who has assessed the situation with every faculty available to her and has arrived at a conclusion that she will not be talked out of. She had chosen. Rachel understood before anyone else. She knelt in the snow of the driveway, and her tears fell without sound. And she nodded once the way people nod when the truth they are receiving is not the truth they wanted, but is the truth they can see is right. "She's yours," Rachel said. Her voice was steady in the way that only voices held together by enormous effort are steady. "She chose you." David crouched beside his wife. The children came out of the truck and stood in the snow, looking at the dog they remembered and the man they did not know. And the oldest child, a girl of about 9, said something that landed in the silence like a bell struck once in a cathedral. "She looks happy, Mom." Callum knelt beside Kira and placed his hand on her head. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying in a language more honest than words. Sawyer came the next morning. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket and his eyes on his boots and said he was sorry. Callum asked him what he wanted to do next. Sawyer said he wanted to help. That was enough. Wren arrived in the afternoon with files and a plan. A network, small, informal, for winter emergencies, warm spaces, transport, medical triage when roads closed and phones died. She had been thinking about it since the night she examined Scout and found injuries that told a story no fall could explain. Callum said he would help build it. She said she knew he would. She had known since the night he carried a dying puppy into her clinic with the discipline of a soldier and the hands of someone who had not yet forgotten how to be gentle. Holt stopped by at dusk with a box of files and a weariness he did not bother hiding. He set the box on the table and looked around the cabin, seeing the order that was not rigid, the warmth that was not defensive, the evidence of a space that had begun to accommodate more than one man's silence. "It won't be fast," he said. "That's enough," Callum replied. They stood on the porch while the dogs lay in the doorway. Holt talked about affidavits and jurisdiction and the way cases like this resisted neat endings. He also talked about the town and how people would watch first and then decide what they were willing to admit they had seen. Callum listened. He did not rush the future. He knew better than to demand it. As Holt turned to leave, Scout lifted his head from inside the cabin and stared past the trucks toward the bay. Not at a sound, at a shift. The kind of shift that happens when ice that has been holding its shape all winter finally acknowledges the weight it has been carrying and decides to let it go. A long crack traveled the surface of the bay. Then another. The ice exhaled. A sound that was not loud, but carried the specific authority of something that had been waiting a very long time to happen and was no longer willing to wait. Holt smiled despite himself. "Looks like spring found a way," he said. Scout wagged as if agreeing with a truth older than either of them. The days that followed did not fix everything. They steadied it. The way a hand placed on a table steadies the objects on the table without moving any of them, simply by being there, simply by adding weight to the side of stillness. Neighbors stopped by without announcing themselves. Bags of kibble left on the porch. Old blankets folded on the step. A coil of rope from someone who did not explain what the rope was for and did not need to, because rope was useful and usefulness was its own explanation. Some stayed to talk. Some left before Callum reached the door. He took what was offered and let the rest pass without commentary, because he had learned in the last 12 days that help did not always require a conversation, and that sometimes the purest form of kindness was the kind that did not need to be thanked. Scout took his first real steps on a Tuesday afternoon without making a show of it. He wobbled from the blanket to Callum's boot and collapsed there with the satisfied expression of a creature who had just accomplished something monumental and was prepared to rest on his achievements for the remainder of the day. His leg was still cautious, the splint gone now, but the memory of it remaining in the way he placed each paw with a deliberation that seemed to say, "I know what can happen, and I am choosing to walk anyway." His eyes were bright. Too bright for a body that had learned pain this early. But brightness, Callum was discovering, was not the absence of pain. It was the decision to look at the world despite it. He laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out of his chest the way birds leave a tree they have been sitting in for too long suddenly and in several directions at once, and the cabin received it without comment, as if it had been waiting for exactly this sound and was pleased to finally have it in its collection. Scout answered with a bark, small, more question mark than exclamation point. The kind of bark a creature produces when it is testing the acoustics of a new world and wants to know what happens when you put sound into it. Kira rose from her place by the stove and inspected the puppy with the thoroughness of a professional conducting a quality assessment. She sniffed his ears, his paws, the leg that had been broken. Then she licked the top of his head once firmly with the particular economy of a mother who is satisfied with what she sees, but is not going to make a big production about it. That will do. Callum moved through the cabin with a different purpose that week. Not erasing, relocating. He took the photograph of Mara from the mantel above the fireplace where it had sat slightly off-center for 2 years, collecting the orange glow of flames it could not feel, and he carried it to the shelf beside the window where morning light arrived first and stayed longest. He cleaned the frame with a cloth, not reverently but attentively, the way you clean something that matters to you, and that you intend to keep looking at for a long time. He set it on the shelf and adjusted it until it was straight. "I opened the door," he said quietly, not knowing whether he meant the cabin's or his own, suspecting it was both, understanding that it did not matter which, because the door was the same door. It had always been the same door. Grief, he had learned in the last 12 days, did not want to be worshipped. It did not want to sit on a mantel in a dark room being looked at with the kind of reverence that was really just another form of avoidance. It wanted to be carried. It wanted to be taken to a place where it could see the world continuing without it, and to discover that the continuation was not betrayal, but evidence. Evidence that the person who had been loved had loved well enough that the living she left behind were still capable of living. The light through the window found the photograph and held it. Mara smiled from the frame, dark hair pulled back, eyes that had always known where Callum was, even in a crowded room. She looked in this new light less like someone who had been lost and more like someone who had been waiting for the man she loved to find a window with enough light to see her by. Marge came on a Thursday evening. She brought nothing. She sat on the porch beside Callum with a cup of tea she had made in his kitchen without asking, and looked out at the bay where the ice was retreating in ragged shapes that clicked together like polite applause. They sat in the kind of silence that is not empty, but furnished the silence of two people who have said enough to each other to know that not everything requires words, and that the things that do require words will announce themselves when they are ready. Kira lay between them. Her muzzle rested on Marge's knee. Her tail brushed Callum's boot. She had arranged herself as a bridge between two people who had been alone for different reasons and for different lengths of time, and who were now, by the slow accumulation of days and soup and conversations held beside fires, becoming something that neither of them would have named, but both of them recognized. "Lloyd used to say something," Marge said after a while. Her voice was quiet, reflective, not sad. The voice of a woman who had made peace with the distance between the life she had planned and the life she had received, and had discovered that the difference contained things she would not have chosen, but would not now return. He said, "God doesn't put people in your life because you're ready for them. He puts them there because you need them, and they need you. Being ready is something that comes after. Sometimes long after." Callum did not respond immediately. He looked at the bay. He looked at the sky, which had cleared for the first time in what felt like weeks, the blue so clean and sharp, it looked like something that had been washed and hung out to dry. He looked at Scout, who had found his way to the edge of the porch and was staring at a seagull with the intensity of a creature who had just discovered that the world contained things with wings and had not yet decided how he felt about it. "Lloyd sounds like he knew what he was talking about," Callum said. Marge smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that arrives when the person smiling is not performing happiness, but remembering it and finding that the memory, even after 8 years, still has warmth in it. "He usually did," she said. "Took me about 20 years to admit it." On a clear morning near the end of the week, Callum took the dogs down to the shoreline. The ice had pulled back from the sand, retreating into the deeper water, where it held on in shapes that grew smaller every day. The bay was opening. Color was returning to its surface, not the frozen white of winter, but the gray and blue and green of water that was remembering how to move. Scout tested the sand and startled at the way it shifted beneath his paws. He looked back at Callum with an expression of profound betrayal, as if the ground itself had violated a trust he thought they had established. Then he barked at a gull that was standing on a rock 12 feet away and did not care. The gull looked at him, looked away, and continued being a gull, which was a level of indifference that Scout found both offensive and fascinating. Kira stood at the edge where water met cold air. She closed her eyes. She breathed deeply, her ribs expanding, her nose working the breeze. She stood there for a long time longer than she usually stood at any window or post, and Callum understood that she was not standing guard. She was standing still, allowing herself, perhaps for the first time since a man with clean paperwork took her from a family that loved her, to simply be in a place without needing to watch for what the place might do to her. Resting. The kind of rest that comes after a long carrying, when the thing you held has been set down in a place where it will stay. Callum watched the bay and understood something he had not permitted himself to articulate in 2 years of silence and discipline, and the careful management of a grief he had mistaken for loyalty. Destiny did not announce itself with thunder. It did not arrive with flashing lights or orchestral swells, or the voice of God speaking from a cloud in language clear enough to leave no room for doubt. It arrived with weight. The specific, ordinary, undeniable weight of a living thing that needed to be held, and a door that needed to be opened, and a man who had forgotten he was capable of both, until a dog covered in snow and blood stood on his porch in the worst storm of the year and reminded him, by doing nothing more complicated than looking him in the eye and refusing to look away. He had not saved the world. He had kept a door open on a night when everything inside him wanted it closed. The rest had followed because it could. Because doors that stay open let things through, and the things that come through storms, as Marge had told him on his second day with the dogs, carry reasons that do not require understanding, only acceptance. Only the willingness to stand in the doorway and let the cold in, along with whatever the cold is carrying, and trust that the warmth you have built is strong enough to hold them both. The cabin sat on the hill behind him, catching the morning light the way it caught everything quietly, without asking for attention. Its window faced the bay. Its door faced the road. It held warmth and silence, and the smell of wood smoke and dog fur and coffee that someone had finally started drinking, and it did not look like a signal or a landmark or a monument to anything. It looked like a home. Scout barked once more at the gull, which still did not care. Kira opened her eyes and turned from the water and walked to Callum and sat beside him with her shoulder against his leg, which was where she sat when the world was in order and the watch was done. And the only thing left to do was be present in a place that had earned the right to be called safe. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what you believe God is teaching you in this season of your life. And if you want more stories of faith and courage and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to give up on broken things, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next one. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He bring warmth to your home, peace to your mind, strength to your heart, and protection over you and everyone you love.